Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pat Rutledge, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Marco Island Historical Society. And I'd like to welcome you to really a fascinating presentation that we'll be sharing with you. I'm going to give folks a little bit of time to join in. And so if you wouldn't mind, as you are becoming part of our program, if you'd like to put into chat where it is that you're joining us from. We're always so interested to see where our participants are. We've had folks join us from Brazil. We've had folks join us from the UK and all across the country. So if you're so inclined, please let us know where you're signing in from. And we'll just give it a moment, as I said, and let folks join into the webinar. All right, we've got folks joining in, which is fabulous. Again, we'll just give it another moment or two. So we have someone joining us from Capri. I'm wondering, is that the Isles of Capri or is that European Capri? Yes, European Capri, really? That's amazing. Oh, no, Isles, okay. Isles of Capri, which is not too far from where we are. Well, thanks for telling us that you're here. Oh, we have someone from Marco. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Because I like to begin on time. Again, my name is Pat Rutledge, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Marco Island Historical Society, and we're your hosts this afternoon. And I am delighted to introduce to you our speaker. Mr. Wayne Wood is widely regarded as one of the foremost chroniclers of Northeast Florida's history and architecture. Dr. Wayne Wood has been called the undisputed godfather of preservation in Jacksonville. He is an author, historian, artist, and self-proclaimed arts agitator. He is also the founder of Riverside Avondale Preservation, one of the largest neighborhood preservation groups in the southeastern United States. He has published 18 books on Northeast Florida, including an award-winning 432-page Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, Landmarks for the Future. Wayne is the historian at large for the Jacksonville History Center. And his topic this afternoon is the amazing architecture of Northeast Florida. So welcome, Wayne.
Thank you, Pat. It's a pleasure to be here, and greetings to our Zoom audience, members who are in Marco Island as well as around the United States. I'd like to thank Marco Island Historical Society for inviting me to be with you today. And I would also like to thank Florida Humanities, the sponsor of my presentation. Florida Humanities is a wonderful organization that does much to support cultural awareness in our state. Although my presentation today is mainly about the architecture of Northeast Florida, I'd like to begin with a few comments about Southwest Florida. The current exhibit at the Marco Island Museum is about the Florida House and the distinctive architecture of the Mackle brothers and their Deltona Corporation, which was prominently featured on Marco Island during the 60s and 70s. The Mackle brothers advertised their modest and inexpensive concrete block vacation and retirement houses in newspapers and magazines across the country. Here you see an ad from Life magazine in 1958. The Mackle's campaign was to sell sunshine, and this was just one manifestation of a broader trend as builders in post-war Florida sought to capture the disposable income of middle-class vacationers and older adults, flush with their retirement pensions. $10 down and $10 a month was hard to resist. The Mackle brothers were the largest home builders in the country by 1959. In 1962, they began the development of Marco Island. The homes had a lot of variety, but they also had a lot of similar traits. And this is now referred to as ranch style homes. This mid-century modern home style was prevalent across the Sun Belt. These houses were single-story, single-family homes. They had long, low-pitched roof lines with wide eaves. They had multi-plane roofs and generally concrete block construction. They almost always featured an attached garage or carport and often had sliding glass doors opening onto a patio in the back. They had windows with large glass area on the front and often had jalousie or awning windows like you see in this picture. Most of these homes were designed by Herb Savage, who was the Mackle brothers' main architect from Marco Island. Herb graduated from the University of Illinois in 1949, and he was instrumental in shaping the island's modern look and feel. His designs include Marco Island Yacht Club, the Country Club, City Hall, Marco Island Resort, as well as many of the homes there. Now, a recent trend has been the demolition of these older homes on Marco Island, and they're being replaced by a larger residential structure. This is an unfortunate trend because these original homes make up the historic character of the island. Herb Savage was not a nationally renowned architect, and most of the original homes on Marco Island are not likely to be featured in a compendium of America's great buildings, but they have the authenticity of Marco Island, and collectively they represent a distinctive moment in Florida architecture. As an architectural collection, they should be considered eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and I hope we can save as many of them as possible. So, why should we care about architecture? Architecture is perhaps the most public of the arts. Our buildings are out there for everyone to see and enjoy. They're not hidden inside a museum or a gallery. We share them as a community on a daily basis. They define our cities and towns, and they are physical embodiments of our history. They are what make our town different from all those other places. But ironically, architecture is the most fragile of the arts. Buildings made of stone and steel with foundations cemented in the earth are less likely to survive than a poem or a painting or a symphony or a book. So let's talk about architecture. Our state of Florida is blessed with great architecture and beautiful buildings. But here's an amazing fact. My little corner of Northeast Florida almost certainly has more historic buildings, more significant architecture, perhaps than the entire rest of the state combined. From St. Augustine to Fernandina, we have a rich variety and impressive array of great buildings. And the reason that Northeast Florida has so many historic buildings is because we started ahead of the rest of the state. This map from 1823 shows Florida only 2 years after it achieved statehood in 1821. And you can see from this map that most of the state was unsettled other than the indigenous people. But our northeast corner of the state, St. Augustine, Jacksonville, and Fernandina were already thriving towns in 1823 because they were inland seaports and they were near the King's Road. So fasten your seatbelts because we're going to take a tour of 350 years of Florida history and architecture in the next 45 minutes. The buildings you are about to see are just a fraction of the landmarks in our northeast corner of the state. So let's start with the oldest city in our group. Indeed, St. Augustine is the oldest city in the United States. Founded in 1565, it's over 450 years old. Florida was owned by Spain from 1513 until 1821, when it was ceded to the United States. The British ruled Florida briefly from 1763 to 1783, but basically St. Augustine and the state of Florida were Spanish throughout this time. And today, St. Augustine has still a very European feel to it with its narrow, winding streets. 100 years after St. Augustine was founded, the Castillo de San Marcos was built. It's the oldest intact Spanish fort in the United States north of Puerto Rico. The Castillo San Marcos is Spanish for St. Mark's Castle. And uniquely, it's built of coquina stone, which was an aggregate formed by millions of years of tiny seashells building up along the beach. And this is the first of 6 castles on our tour today. Now, here are the city gates of St. Augustine. They were built during the Spanish era in 1808, and one has to be really impressed by the antiquity of St. Augustine still today. Those old Spanish gates are still there, and you can see they're made of that same coquina aggregate stone. Now, a lot of people see St. Augustine as a tourist trap with lots of kitschy things to see and do. But if you look past all that, you see a wonderful city that has charm and elegance and the brush of antiquity on it. And you see houses like the old drugstore. This was built in 1739, if you can imagine, almost 300 years old, and it's still there, as well as the oldest wooden schoolhouse, 1740. And the antiquity of these buildings just never ceases to amaze me, how these buildings can still be standing in America more than many other buildings across the country. The Gonzalez Alvarez house is the oldest one, dating to 1723. And here is a picture of it today. And you have many other old houses. I'll flip through these just so you can see the variety and quantity of these old Spanish era homes that still exist in old St. Augustine. One of my favorites is the Ximenes Facio house, built in 1798. It's owned by the colonial dames, and it's quite a wonderful museum. And when you visit St. Augustine, don't miss taking a tour of this building. It perhaps shows more about the Spanish era in St. Augustine than any other. There are many really old buildings that are religious in nature, not just residential. The Catholic Cathedral, the Basilica goes back to 1797. It's still there. And next door, 100 years later, was built this tower that dates from 1887. But the combination of those two are a wonderful grouping, as is this Episcopal church. The part you see on your left is the original 1834 structure, and on the right is the 1902 structure, both still old. And there are many old houses. One of the older ones is the Stanbury House. We call this style of architecture Carpenter Gothic. It's got a little Gothic to it, but none of the formal traits of Gothic architecture. There's an old lighthouse. This is the first of 3 lighthouses we're going to visit on our tour. It dates back to 1874. But the building that gets everyone's attention, that's the heart of St. Augustine, is the old Ponce de Leon Hotel. Henry Flagler was a millionaire, one of the principals in John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, who came to Florida to visit for his health and just fell in love with St. Augustine and began building a series of buildings in St. Augustine, but none could surpass the grandeur of the St. Augustine, of the Ponce de Leon Hotel. It was designed by 2 young architects. This was actually their first major commission. Their names were Carrere and Hastings, and they designed this a Spanish colonial sort of Byzantine architecture that would be a remarkable edifice anywhere in the world. But here it is in Florida, still existing today. It was one of the first buildings in the country wired for electricity from the very beginning. And the DC generators were installed by Henry Flagler's friend, Thomas Edison. The building itself is made out of poured concrete using the local coquina stone as an aggregate. And we'll see many of the buildings built in the Flagler era have this same form of construction. Here you see the great Ponce de Leon Hotel in an aerial view that shows how it takes up quite a great deal of downtown St. Augustine. And here's a view from the ground looking at the towers and minarets. It's a spectacular building, and I urge you when you go to St. Augustine to take a tour of this building. The tours are twice a day, but you need to book them ahead of time, and you can do that on the internet, and you won't be disappointed at all. Today, the hotel has been converted to a college. It's Flagler College. Here you see the entrance with a statue of Henry Flagler out front. Flagler College is certainly one of the most beautiful college campuses in America. Let's go inside and take a look. So we go through the courtyard into the grand entrance doors, and the foyer has a 3-story rotunda, highly embellished with art and wood carving. Flagler brought hundreds of construction workers from Europe to do the carving and painting and construction. These old world craftsmen gave it a look like nothing else. Here you see looking up into the rotunda of the dome. And as we go through the college, one of my favorite rooms is the dining room. This was designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany, the famed designer and glassmaker. When I was a teenager, before the hotel closed in 1969, I was able to eat lunch with my uncle in this old dining room of the great Ponce de Leon Hotel. I remember it to this day. So Flagler went on a building binge when he came to St. Augustine. He built several hotels. Here you see the Alcazar Hotel that he built shortly after the Ponce de Leon. And today it is the Leitner Museum of Hobbies, as well as the civic building for the city of St. Augustine. And it's built in a similar Spanish colonial style. Next door to that was the Casa Monica Hotel. It was actually built by a rival of Flagler's, Franklin Smith, who came there before Flagler did. Flagler eventually bought the hotel, changing the name to the Hotel Cordova, and now it's recently been remodeled and restored and is now once again the Casa Monica Hotel, a great place to stay when you go to St. Augustine. Flagler used his wealth to also embellish the city. He donated money to build Grace United Methodist Church. You see also designed by Carrere and Hastings in a similar style. And the Memorial Presbyterian Church. He was not partial to one religion over the other, but this was his church where he went to the Presbyterian Church. And it's quite a grand building, making up the landmarks of St. Augustine. There are many wonderful houses dating back after the Spanish period. I'd like to highlight a few of those. This is an unusual octagon house. St. Augustine is partly on an island, Anastasia Island, and the octagon house is on the Anastasia. And here's the O'Brien house. This is on the Matanzas River at Moultrie Point, quite a elaborate Queen Anne Victorian home. And the Dismuke house, also an old one. You see the wonderful porch post and railing. And this is the Upham College. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about different styles of architecture, but the Upham Cottage features some of the best East Lake ornament. Now, these buildings built at this time are Queen Anne in style. You see they have porch posts, railings, balconies. They're very unsymmetrical. And the East Lake ornament was like furniture built with wood lathes turned, and these decorated the porches of many of the Queen Anne homes of the era. But we also have other brick homes like Villa Flora, which goes back to 1896. Casa de Sueños, and one of the tallest building in St. Augustine is the First National Bank. It carried some of that same architectural motif of Flagler's buildings, but it was built much later in 1828. Also, there's a sizable neighborhood called Lincolnville, and this was an African-American community that rose after the Civil War, built by freed slaves. In the 1920s and 30s, during the Jim Crow era, it was where segregated African Americans made their homes. And this is just one of many. This is the home of Cora Tyson, who was one of the civil rights champions in the 1960s. And Martin Luther King stayed in this house when he came to St. Augustine. And on the other hand, it's kind of jarring compared to all those ancient homes, but we see ultra modern homes in St. Augustine also, like this house designed by modern architects Peter Rumpel and Roxanne Harvath. Here's another castle. Fort Matanzas is several miles from St. Augustine on the Matanzas River, but it's one of the many forts built during the Spanish era and forms our collection of 6 different castles that we're going to see in St. Augustine. I would call this a castle too. It was Villa Zoreda. It was also built by Franklin Smith, who designed the Casa Monica, and it was his private home, and he intended it to be very much like a castle with its crenellated tower. Here it is today, and this is open for tours and is quite a nice house museum showing the furnishings of the 1880s. Another of the castles we're going to see is Castle Warden, and this was owned by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, the famous author, and it later got turned into a museum. It is now Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. So when you go to St. Augustine, you can also tour that one. My favorite castle in all of St. Augustine is actually at Villano Beach out on the island. It's called Castle Otis. Now, you're not reading that incorrectly. There are 3 T's in the name Castle Otis. It was built by 2 guys in 1988, Otis Sadler and Rusty Icks, and they did not intend to build it as a residence. They just built it as a landscape sculpture, never intended to be anything other than just something unusual. But now it's become quite a popular wedding venue, and you can certainly imagine that something exotic like this rising high above the sand dunes on the beach is quite an unusual sight to see. The final castle in our collection is called the Pink Castle. This was actually a residence and studio built by the sculptor Charles Adrian Pillars. Pillars designed this house not using blueprints the way you would build a normal house, but he built a clay sculpture of the house, and from that the builders were able to construct it. The tall portion you see over here on the left side was his studio. It was a 32-foot high room, and that's where he designed the famous sculpture Life, which now adorns Memorial Park in Jacksonville's Riverside Avondale Historic District. I consider this to be one of the great bronze sculptures in all of the state of Florida. And if you come to Jacksonville, be sure not to miss that. I did write a book about Pillars and the story of his amazing life. He was certainly the greatest sculptor in Florida at the time. So let's now switch to the next city on our list. Founded in 1811, before Florida was a state, Fernandina, which is now called Fernandina Beach, which is kind of an interesting story in itself. Fernandina was named after King Ferdinand VII of Spain, and it's located on Amelia Island. And Amelia was the daughter of King George II, even though it was owned by Spain at the time. James Oglethorpe later conquered all these islands for England and named it after the king. And the reason it's called Fernandina Beach, not Fernandina, because it was Fernandina for a long, long time. We'll look at this 1918 map. The original town of Fernandina was up here on the north part of what is now Amelia Island. And in 1857, a railroad man named David Yulee built the first cross-Florida railroad, and he had its terminus in Fernandina. And he built this town, which he considered to be the Manhattan of the South. And he didn't want to build it up at the top because it was separated by this big marsh. And so the 2 towns were separate, Old Town and New Town. And gradually you'll see by the 1920s, there were people starting to build houses out at the beach. So in 1951, Fernandina and Fernandina Beach merged, with the Fernandina Beach name being the one that seemed more marketable. And so that's why it's called Fernandina Beach today and not just Fernandina. Here's a picture of Center Street, the main street in Fernandina in 1926. And the reason that I want to point this out is because it still looks exactly like that. The wonderful part about Fernandina is it's an old Victorian town that still is largely intact. It's rare in Florida, much less in America, to have a town that has all of its old storefronts and buildings along Main Street. There's a Palace Saloon, dates back to the 1870s. So this was a railroad town and a tourist town in the 1870s and 80s. And most of these commercial buildings are still there, making this a very charming town. And it's, you know, a nice place to stay and go shopping and enjoy the old architecture. Certainly it has one of the most beautiful city halls in all of Florida, this courthouse. Here's the old railroad station. It has its old lighthouse, which is the oldest lighthouse in our tour today, dating to 1839. And it also has a fort. The fort was originally built in the 1840s during the so-called Seminole Wars. And later during the Civil War, it was built up to its current configuration by the Confederates. But let's look at the houses of Fernandina. It's a very small town, and you can easily walk through and see every slide I'm going to show you today. All these old houses, some of them dating back to the 1850s. Here's a boarding house built by David Yulee, the railroad man, to house his railroad workers as well as his celebrity guests who came to town. And it's still a hotel dating back to 1859. Here you see some of the old houses dating from before and right after the Civil War. This Catholic church. Another house from the 1870s. Here's my favorite house in Fernandina Beach, the Fairbanks house. This is kind of a Queen Anne style home with its Italianate tower. It was designed by Fernandina's most important architect. His name was Robert Schuyler, and he did a number of houses, including the Tabby House. This is built with poured tabby cement, like the other buildings we saw in St. Augustine, and has quite an elaborate array of porch posts and balconies. Schuyler also did St. Peter's Episcopal Church, one of the most prominent churches in the city. He also designed the old schoolhouse, but we'll meet him again in a little while when we go to Jacksonville. Now, here we see some of the typical Queen Anne style homes. Queen Anne, again, is typified by porches and balconies and very asymmetrical architecture. And Fernandina has a plethora of these wonderful old homes, and they're all intact and right side by side. You can walk down the street and see one after the other. This particular house is in the Old Town part of St. Augustine, and if you look at it a minute, you may recognize it. This is the house that was featured in the movie Pippi Longstockings, very famous for that. Here's another great Queen Anne house with its turret and porches, and you get the idea of the variety that this Victorian style of architecture created. Here's another Queen Anne style house, and it's important because it was designed by architect George Franklin Barber. Barber didn't live in Fernandina, but he was the most prolific architect in the entire United States. Why, do you ask? He sold his house plans through mail order catalogs. Over 20,000 of his plans were purchased, and no doubt thousands and thousands of his homes were built and exist across America. Here's a page out of his catalog. You see design number 147 that could be purchased for $125, and then you get the plans from this architect and you build it. In fact, that's what they did. And the Bailey House in Fernandina is number 147, right out of George Franklin Barber's house plan catalog. There were many other houses designed by other architects. We don't know the names of all of them, but it does give Fernandina this atmosphere of a town of its time, and the fact that it's so cohesive and still so much intact makes it a worthy part of your destination when you go touring around Florida. The quality of these homes and the maintenance of them is just remarkable. Here you see a little bit different style. This is a Mission Revival style house built for the mayor in 1910. Now, 8 miles south of Fernandina, still on Amelia Island, we find an African-American community that was built in the 30s. This African-American community was called American Beach, and it was built by Abraham Lincoln Lewis, Florida's first Black millionaire. He was the owner of the African-American life insurance company. And in those segregated Jim Crow days, African Americans were not allowed to go to the white beaches. And so Lewis built a beach, in fact, built an entire community so that African Americans from actually all over the South came to this as a major resort where they got to enjoy the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. And there were many houses built. It was actually a small town. Here you see a few of them that are still left. Many of them have been torn down for modern development, but you can see some of these early African-American homes that were part of American Beach. Sadly, Abraham Lincoln Lewis's own home, the beach house, which was built in 1935, was torn down just 5 years ago, and we lost with it part of the little town's history. So now let's go to Jacksonville. Jacksonville, although founded in 1822, is the youngest of our three cities, but it perhaps has the widest variety of architecture and the largest number of landmark buildings, perhaps more than any other in the entire state of Florida. On May the 3rd, 1901, Jacksonville burned. It was the second largest city fire in the history of the United States after the Great Fire of Chicago. 90% of the downtown Jacksonville was destroyed in a single afternoon. The glow of the flames could be seen in the sky as far away as Savannah and Miami. An area over 2 square miles was laid waste. 2,368 buildings were destroyed. And as you might expect, after the fire, architects and builders and entrepreneurs came from all over the country to get a part of the rebuilding of Jacksonville. There were many buildings before the fire that still exist because the fire was only in downtown. And in the outlying areas of Jacksonville, like Fort George Island, you see some very old buildings like Kingsley Plantation, built in 1897. And by the way, if you're a tourist to Northeast Florida, be sure to take a visit to Fort George Island. It still has intact all the old slave cabins and barns and buildings from an actual working plantation from the late 1700s and early 1800s. Other early buildings go back to before Florida became a state. In 1848, the Richard House, another plantation house, the Red Bank Plantation, and the Samus Plantation. This dates from the 1850s. And the Jordan Plantation House, built in 1855. And our lighthouse, which was built in 1858. This house was built as a hotel in 1867. Jacksonville at that point, after the Civil War, was the largest tourist destination for the eastern United States. And there were many hotels, including this one. In fact, Abraham Lincoln's widow, Mary Todd Lincoln, stayed briefly in this house when it was a hotel. And it's still preserved today, only it got moved down the river and is in a residential neighborhood today. There you see it on River Boulevard. Same old house, just out of time. In Mandarin, a suburb of Jacksonville, Harriet Beecher Stowe famously took up residence, And this is the community center, which she built for freed slaves to get their education. Another house in the Mandarin area dates back to the 1870s. Just some beautiful architecture and great old homes that give you a flavor of when this was just a farming community. Here's the Durkee House at the Empire Point neighborhood, dating from the 1880s. And the house of Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward on Fort George Island. This one dates to 1878. Old St. Luke's Hospital was the first Florida hospital, built in 1878. And another hospital was Brewster Hospital, and this was built in 1885. And you can tell that as you look at your screen closely. You see the date of the building, 1885, is carved right into the columns, and this building is on the National Register of Historic Places. Many other riverfront houses were along the river outside downtown area, so these were not burned during the fire. And two other old buildings. On the left, you see the Merrill House. This was built in the 1880s and is now a house museum owned by the Jacksonville History Center. And if you go to Jacksonville, be sure to take that tour. It's one of the most fantastic house museums, I think, in the southeastern United States. And next to it is Old St. Andrew's Church, also designed by that Fernandina architect, Robert Schuyler. This was designed in 1888, and it survived the fire because it was across the creek from where the fire stopped. And also that both those buildings are owned by the Jacksonville Historical Center, part of its 5-building campus. Here you see another building designed by Schuyler at the beach. It's an old Episcopal church dating from the 1880s, and it's now part of the Beaches Museum's historical park, where they have 9 historic buildings moved to one site so you can take a tour of all of them. Now, many people don't know, but Jacksonville was the center of the silent movie industry beginning in 1808. Most of the film companies were headquartered in New York, and they would only be able to shoot films during the summer months. So when they got a steamboat, the Clyde Line steamers came to Florida, they began making movies here in the wintertime. And this is the old Eagle Film Studio. It's one of only 2 silent film studios remaining on Earth. Somehow it never got torn down. And in the 1930s, interesting, this is where a man named Richard Norman made black action movies using all African-American casts. The building is still there today and is a museum of the silent movie industry. Now, here's another of our Victorian buildings, Queen Anne style with a turret. And when I visit a city, I like to just look around when I go to any particular neighborhood. I always say, what time is it? Meaning, if you look at the architecture, you can tell what time that neighborhood was built. Here in the Springfield neighborhood, we see a building of this same era with a turret in the Queen Anne style. So it's 1880s and 90s. This is 1893, another Queen Anne style building with this. If you see a little tower on a building and it's asymmetrical like this, especially if it has gingerbread around the porches, then you know you're in the Queen Anne style, and it's 1890s. Closely following that was the shingle style. This was popularized in the seacoast towns of the Northeast. Houses made with shingles can withstand the sand blowing all year round. And shingle style houses are typified by shingle style roofs. The walls are shingles and the columns are shingled. Every part except the wood trim is covered with shingles. And you see houses like this. This typically is 1890s and 1900 for the shingle style. And then we have the neoclassical revival style. It's very formal. It's one of the many colonial revival styles, and many people just call this colonial revival, but it's a neoclassical style with formal columns, very formal architectural flourishes, and you see all kinds of buildings like this. This was typical after the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, called the White City, popularized neoclassical architecture. So for the generations after that, every bank building, every fancy residence, every post office had these big columns on the front, dating back to Rome and Greece. Here you see another bank building with this formal neoclassical style. Perhaps the grandest of all is Jacksonville's Union Terminal Railroad Station, which has 13 grand Ionic columns across the front. But also people of wealth built homes like this. And you can think back to Tara and Gone with the Wind, the big wealthy plantation homes also influenced this style. Here you see the Federal Reserve Bank with its big columns. This was designed by Henrietta Dozier, who is Florida's first female architect, and she built many buildings in Jacksonville. Here you see the public library. This was designed by a young architect named Henry John Klutho, Klutho. He came to Jacksonville after the Great Fire, trying to rebuild it, and he was schooled in the Beaux-Arts or classical school of architecture. Here you see one of the homes he designed for one of the wealthy business leaders. But in 1904, he met Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright and he struck up a friendship, and Klutho suddenly changed from that neoclassical style to this radical prairie style that Frank Lloyd Wright and his acolytes out in the Midwest were espousing, to have a house with broad bands of windows. There's not a trace of ancient Roman columns, ancient Roman arches and Greek columns, or any European trapping. This is a pure new American architecture that was very, very avant-garde for its time. And Klutho built many buildings in this style. Here you see the Shriners Temple, that if you're familiar with Unity Temple, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in Oak Park, Illinois, this one pays homage to that building. But again, you see very abstract geometry and a totally new concept in architecture. Klutho designed this apartment building on Main Street. If you look at it just as a work of sculpture and not a building, it is actually a wonderful composition, and it has cantilever balconies and 24-karat gold windows and doors right out of Frank Lloyd Wright's playbook. Klutho's magnum opus, and the largest building built in Jacksonville after the fire, was this department store building with elements of Frank Lloyd Wright as well as Louis Sullivan. Although Frank Lloyd Wright was probably the most famous architect of all times, Louis Sullivan was, in my mind, the greatest architect. He was Frank Lloyd Wright's teacher. And this huge department store building took up an entire city block, the ninth largest department store in the United States. And the bottom 2 floors were occupied by the store, and then the upper 3 floors were office buildings for professional doctors, lawyers, and so forth. And if you know Louis Sullivan, you look closely at the crowning glory of the tower here is this wonderful burst of ornament right out of Louis Sullivan's design book. This is made of a wonderful ceramic material called terracotta that allowed architects to design abstract shapes to give buildings a human scale. Here's another picture inside the St. James building designed by Klutho. It had an octagonal glass dome held up by 8 large figures of Atlas. And the entire outside of the building was embellished with these wonderful abstract ornaments composed of geometric shapes, leaves, berries, and seed pods. And that building is now Jacksonville City Hall. It's one of the most beautiful city halls in America, and also perhaps the largest city hall in the world, largest prairie style building in the world. Klutho designed several skyscrapers, and this is a 10-story Bisbee building, the very first skyscraper in Florida. And around the corner on the left, you see the Florida Life building. And Louis Sullivan, the architect I mentioned, was the father of the American skyscraper. And he proclaimed that a skyscraper must be a tall and soaring thing. And Clutho certainly lived up to that in this building that has a sweeping upward shaft, very narrow. And even though it's only 10 stories tall, it scrapes the sky, just like Louis Sullivan said. The top of the building is crowned by this wonderful burst of Sullivan-esque ornament made of terracotta. Unfortunately, that was removed 20 years ago by an out-of-town developer. And so our hope is these two skyscrapers framing this marble bank building, classical building, we call them the Laura Street Trio. They're the most pressing preservation challenge in Jacksonville, and hopefully they will be under restoration before long. So Clutho's bringing the prairie style to Jacksonville had many influences on other architects, including this wonderful prairie style building in the Riverside Avondale Historic District by another architect. Here you see some of the other buildings that have the Florida version of the prairie style with big bands of windows, wide overhanging eaves, porches and balconies. This is the home where my wife and I live, and it's one of the larger prairie style houses left in Florida. And here's a prairie style influenced building by two of Frank Lloyd Wright's proteges, and it somewhat emanates the Wainwright building that Louis Sullivan did in St. Louis. Now, this is not prairie style. This is what we call the Mediterranean style. So if you're in the prairie style of architecture, this is 1908 to 1920. The prairie style died out after World War I. When you see a building like this that has tile roofs, masonry walls, kind of a Spanishy Italian feel, you know you're in the 1920s. And this Mediterranean style proliferated in Florida in the 1920s. It was the signature architectural style. It was popularized by a man named Addison Meisner, who is a Palm Beach and Boca Raton architect who brought this style to Florida from California. And he didn't invent it, but he popularized it in a way. This is, by the way, designed by Addison Meisner. Riverside Baptist Church was the only church that he designed, but his influence was far and wide. You see buildings like this was built as a hotel in the peak of the 1920s, later went bankrupt and became a school. This is now the Bowles School, which is, I think, the most beautiful high school in America. Mansions were built in this Mediterranean style, and you see the similarities. They have trappings of Venice and Rome and Spain, and they were retrospectively called Mediterranean Revival style because they reflect this architecture of the Mediterranean. Now, if you went to Italy, you might find a building that looked like this, but most of the Mediterranean Revival styles are just an American architect's idea of what that architecture would look like. Here you see one with Venetian influences and a pentagonal house. And these are not copies of any house in Spain or Italy, but they have that reflection of this boom period of Florida where newly rich residents wanted to take on the trappings of wealth of Europe. And so you see these Mediterranean Revival houses. And as you go around Florida, if you ever see a house that has these traits, you'll say, aha, what time is it? We're in the 1920s. Even the great movie palaces of Florida, we have the Florida Theater, which was built in the 20s, has trappings of the Mediterranean Revival style, has wonderful, colorful terracotta. This was one of three great movie palaces from the 20s left in Florida, one in Miami and one in Tampa. Here you see the interior, quite spectacular. If you come to Jacksonville, try to take in a show at the Florida Theater. And other buildings like this have this wonderful terracotta adornment that make it part of this 1920s style. Now, this is different. This is Tudor revival style. And all of these revival styles are revivals of styles that were popular in Europe, and that's why they're called revival. Tudor style emanated from England, and it's typified by half timbering, this combination of wood over masonry. And in the original Tudor houses, the wood slats, let me go back. These were structural with the stucco in between, and now they're just adornments for the house. You see large chimneys, and then there's a variation of the Tudor style called Jacobean Revival style. This was rarely used in houses. It was more likely to be used in churches and college campuses. But here you see this mansion built for Joel Cheek, the heir of the Maxwell House Conflict Company. And we also have Gothic Revival style. Gothic Revival style is typified by these pointed arch windows. Anytime you see pointed arches, particularly on churches, you know that's Gothic Revival. Here you see some other variations of the Gothic Revival style in churches in Jacksonville. The bungalow is the most prevalent style of architecture in all of Florida and is often dismissed as just a minor architectural movement. But from 1905 to the 1940s, the bungalow was the most popular style of architecture, and Jacksonville has more bungalows than any other city in Florida. And bungalows are typified by an open porch. They usually have a half story in the top where there was a bedroom, and they have nice craftsman style adornments and a lot of built-in furniture. And these can take on various styles, but they always have that same format. Then we have the Georgian Revival style, a very formal style of architecture, very symmetrical. And then when we hit the 1930s, we go into Art Deco. So what time is it? Now we're 1930. Art Deco, of course, is typified by geometric forms and sharp angular abstract shapes. And it was intended to be an answer to modern architecture. You think of Rockefeller Center. All this was in New America Rising, even though it was during the Depression. Here's an apartment building with some Art Deco traits. And following up on Art Deco was Art Moderne. This used to be a gas station. It's now a restaurant, but you can see this Buck Rogers spaceship type tower. And Art Moderne featured more rounded, soft, streamlined shapes, such as this drugstore built in the 1930s. That's Art Moderne, M-O-D-E-R-N-E. Another example, sometimes called streamlined modern. And then you just have exotic buildings like this Buddhist temple. We have 2 Buddhist temples in Jacksonville, and they're among my favorite and most exotic examples of Northeast Florida architecture. Following up, we come to the 50s. What time is it? We're definitely in the 1950s and 60s now. This architecture was retrospectively called mid-century modern. It was an effort to be super modern after the doldrums of World War II. Young architects came out and built spectacular buildings using new forms of concrete and new geometric decorations made from concrete. Here you see a mid-century modern tower that was a 5-building, 19-story department store with a honeycomb facade, and it had a rotating restaurant around the top. This building is now for sale if you'd like to buy a 19 stories mid-century modern skyscraper. And other architects played with concrete forms. This is just as much a work of sculpture as it is a church. And seen from the air, you can see some of the wonderful geometric delight that architects took in using this form of architecture. Here's a bank, and it celebrates this concrete brise de soleil shapes of concrete. This building is in court now, may be torn down to build a car wash, unfortunately. Here's another spectacular mid-century modern building designed by architect Kendrick Bang Kellogg. He's a California architect, widely known. He just passed away last year. And the abstraction of this building is just hard to fathom. It actually is the chart house. When seen from the ground, it looks like this on one side, And the other side is a totally different building, like some sea creature crawling into the river. But this is, again, the height of mid-century modern, where experimentation with geometric shapes was very much in vogue. This Episcopal Church of St. Paul's by the Sea at the beach was designed by Blake Ellis, an Atlanta architect. And when seen from the air, you can see its amazing curvature, kind of simulating a seagull or a fish. And I love this building. This was featured in the 1964 issue of Playboy magazine, designed by architect William Morgan. He loved buildings built in the earth. He was influenced by Mayan architecture, and he built this home for himself. And next door to it is this wonderfully controversial apartment building that is built in the ground. It's called the Dune House, and it's right next to his own home. Here you see an amazing picture with three of Morgan's buildings side by side, all three different styles. And in a 5-block area, we have 10 of William Morgan's houses. He was known throughout the world and is one of Jacksonville's most famous architects. And he built buildings of all different varieties in this mid-century modern style, including this condominium that looks like a flying saucer and a tree house. All of these are within just a few blocks of each other. So if you come to Atlantic Beach, where this particular collection of buildings is located, be sure to drive along the shore and see these buildings built by William Morgan, who was one of the great mid-century modern architects of Jacksonville. And here's a really strange, wonderful building. It's called the Hayden Burns Library. It was almost torn down to build condos because it is a little strange looking with those fins, but this is so prototypical of the mid-century modern era. Built in 1964, it was the Hayden Burns Library and designed by an architect named Taylor Hardwick, who also designed these drive-in dairy stores for the Skinner Dairy Company, where cars could drive up into this building shaped kind of like a gull's wing, and they could get their milk and drive on their way. Among the very first drive-in restaurants in the world. Another mid-century modern architect was Bob Broward. Here you see a ranch-style house. Doesn't look like any of those Marco Island houses, but this house has a butterfly roof, so the water cascades from the roof into a fountain. And again, it was very avant-garde at the time and still is today. Some of Broward's other buildings show this very creative, free-flowing energy to make buildings that are new and modern. Here is the Unitarian Church, one of his more renowned buildings, or the tree house that Bob Broward built in the middle of a grove of trees. It becomes part of the trees itself, or this very impressive beach house at Ponte Vedra. So if you see buildings like this, you say 1950s, 60s, and 70s, mid-century modern. Here's Broward's own house, very much like some of the earlier prairie-style houses of Frank Lloyd Wright. And Paul Rudolph was the father of the Sarasota School. He designed this wonderful beach house, abstract in its design, at Ponte Vedra. So Jacksonville has some amazingly intricate design skyscrapers. This one designed by Helmut Jahn, one of the most famous architects in modern construction. He passed away a couple years ago too. And we have bridges. This is my favorite bridge. It's the Dames Point Bridge, named after Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. And it was built in 1969 and is ranked as one of the most beautiful cable-stayed bridges in the world. And the last one site I want to visit with you is this bridge. This is the Fuller Warren Bridge, I-95. You cross over as you go through Jacksonville. 15 years ago, I had the idea to do an artist market under this bridge, which is sheltered from the sun and rain. And every Saturday, if you come to Jacksonville, be sure to visit the Riverside Arts Market. There are 150 vendors. There's a 200-seat amphitheater on the river and a big farmer's market. This is the great place to come on Saturdays in Jacksonville. So why am I enthusiastic about this? I want you to explore our state. I want you to see the wonders that we have. And this is just one little corner of the state that you may not have thought much about, but I encourage you to explore, and discover this wonderful state of Florida. And I thank you for having me with you today. Thank you very much.
I mean, that
I'd
was
like
fabulous. That was absolutely
to
fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing those images. And people are posting in the chat, thank you as well. My goodness, what a tour you took us on. So I really appreciate that, and I know our webinar participants do as well. We have gone a little bit over time, but I just wanted to see, are there any questions that people have that they would like to either put in the Q&A or in the chat? And you know, we can either answer them, or I can make sure that we pass them on to Dr. Wood so that he can get back to us with responses. So let's just see if there's anything that people would like to ask. Okay, I've got one, and if it's the only one we do, then that's fine. I just want to know, having seen all of those absolutely stunning buildings, what are your three favorite buildings in Northeast Florida?
Well, I would have to break it down by city. My favorite building in all of St. Augustine would be the Ponce de Leon Hotel, Henry Flagler's magnificent building that's turned into Flagler College. In Fernandina, my favorite is the Fairbanks House. We showed you that house with a tall tower on it. And in Jacksonville, it would be the St. James Hotel, designed by Henry Clutho. That's now the most beautiful city hall in America. It's in the middle of our downtown. And by the way, if you visit Jacksonville, you can go inside the St. James building and see that magnificent 80-foot dome as part of our city hall.
Wonderful, thank you. We have someone posted in the chat, very impressive, Wayne, with an exclamation point. My family lived in St. Augustine for 25 years, and this person absolutely loved the tour. And another thank you for the wonderful tour. So with that, I also say thank you. And I think, Wayne, you've got one more slide that talks about Florida.
I'd like to call attention to the slide on the screen now from Florida Humanities. It's very important to them and to me that you sign up for the survey you'll be sent. You can actually use your camera and photograph it on the screen now, or I believe Pat will send you by email a copy of the survey. Just tell us how you like the program, what you didn't like and did. And also, this is a chance to sign up for the Florida Humanities newsletter. Again, Florida Humanities is a wonderful program that does so much for our state, and I urge you to give them your support.
Thanks, Wayne. And yes, you're absolutely right. You will receive an email from us with a link to the survey. So please do take a moment to fill it out. It's not a long survey. And I just want to echo Dr. Wood's comments about Florida Humanities. You know, we on Marco Island are very focused on the history of Marco Island, but Florida is so history rich. And it's through the organization of Florida Humanities that we get to bring to you these wonderful stories of the different moments of history, the moments in time of Florida. So with that, I thank you all very much, and I thank you, Dr. Wood.
Thank you.